This happened during spring break of my junior year of college. Me and my 3 closest friends, Kevin, Ali, and Seb, decided to go car camping in Colorado. We'd been doing these trips together since freshman year, but we were all pretty broke that semester, so we went with dispersed camping instead of paying for an actual campground. I found this spot on one of those camping apps that showed free sites. It was somewhere outside of Buena Vista, tucked back on this forest service road that seemed to go on forever. The 4 of us had done enough camping together that we knew what we were doing. We got there around late afternoon and found this clearing near what looked like it used to be a creek bed. It was completely dried up, but you could tell water had run through there at some point. The area was pretty isolated. We didn't see any other campers or even tire tracks from recent visitors. It was honestly perfect for the kind of vibe we were going for. We set up our tents in a loose cluster, maybe 15 feet apart from each other. Nothing fancy about the arrangement, just wherever the ground looked level and didn't have too many rocks. I don't even remember what we did that night. Probably just drank a few of the beers we brought while playing cards. We were all pretty tired from the drive, so we called it around 11 and went to our separate tents. I remember sleeping really heavily that night, which was weird for me to begin with, but especially during a camping trip. Usually, and this is when I'm sleeping on a comfortable bed in a climate-controlled room, I wake up multiple times from being cold or needing to pee or whatever else. Point is, I'm a very light sleeper, and during a camping trip, forget it. I'm used to waking up at least 3 times, but that night I felt completely knocked out, like I'd taken a sleeping pill or something. When I woke up the next morning, something felt off immediately. I unzipped my tent to get some fresh air, and then I just froze. I noticed it immediately. All 4 of our tents had been moved. Like, not ruffled or roughed up by an animal, actually moved. They were arranged in this perfect square formation around a pile of stones that definitely hadn't been there when we went to sleep. Part of me felt like I was still dreaming. That's how bizarre and borderline unbelievable the sight before me was. Each tent had been relocated maybe 20 or 30 feet from where we'd originally set them up, but that's not really what freaked me out. The stakes were still perfectly secured in the ground, and nothing inside any of the tents had been disturbed. My sleeping bag was exactly how I left it. My phone was still plugged into my portable charger, and all my other gear was in the same spot. Nothing was missing from my tent, which I checked, double-checked, and triple-checked. I thought I was going crazy. I yelled to wake up my friends. Kevin was the first one to emerge from his tent, and I didn't even have to explain the situation to him. I could see on his face that he was experiencing the same confusion I was. Ali and Seb crawled out a few seconds later, and as I watched them take a look around at the campsite, it was the exact same thing. None of us remembered anything. But then Ali mentioned that she'd had this really vivid dream about walking in a line through some kind of desert landscape while someone counted her steps out loud. And then Kevin chimed in, saying he had a dream about being in the army, marching alongside his fellow soldiers. Seb didn't remember having a dream, and neither did I. But we found it odd that both Ali and Kevin had eerily similar dreams. The vibe between the 4 of us was really weird, but hard to describe. It was almost like we were reading each other's minds. It's kind of hard to express the feeling, but it really did feel like we were more connected than we had been the night before, but in a bad way. I remember looking back and forth between them, trying to figure out what it was that I was feeling around me. The best way I can think to describe the feeling is what it would have felt like if there was a 5th person watching all of us, who was also part of all of us. We examined the campsite a little more carefully, looking for clues or anything that would help us piece together what happened. At first, Kevin suggested that maybe we had just gotten really drunk and forgot about what we did the night before, but this theory was shattered in about 5 seconds. We found these drag marks in the dirt leading from where each tent had originally been positioned to where they ended up. The weird thing was, the drag marks stopped about 10 feet short of each tent's final location, like someone had dragged them part way and then lifted and carried them the rest of the distance. The pile of stones in the center was even stranger. There were exactly 4 stones, and they were balanced on top of each other like some kind of sculpture. It actually would have been pretty were it not for the circumstances. Kevin walked over to get a closer look, and as he was leaning in to examine the top stone, he tripped and ended up knocking the whole thing over. The stones just kind of tumbled to the ground, nothing dramatic. For a second, the four of us just stood there in silence, staring at the scattered stones. And then things went from a 5 to a 10. At the exact same time, all four of us started hearing this low rumbling sound coming from somewhere in the distance. It sounded like rocks grinding against each other. Not like an earthquake or anything, more like an old stone door being pushed open. Hearing that sound kind of sent us into a panic, and we all just started packing without even discussing things. Like I said before, it felt like we were reading each other's minds, and that also applied to our feelings. I could feel my friends' fear, and I knew they could feel mine. It was really freaky, 10 times freakier than it had been not 2 minutes ago. I don't think I've ever packed up a campsite so quickly in my life. Realistically, we were out of there in under 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity in that moment. I'm not going to harp too much on what happened. I really don't like thinking about what happened that night, and I'm worried that if I think too much about it, it'll go from being a fever dream that sort of sits in the back of my mind to something more real. That was 5 years ago now. The four of us don't really see each other anymore, but I guess that's kind of how it goes as everyone gets older. Kevin moved to Denver after graduation. Allie's in grad school in California, and I think Seb moved to Chicago with his girlfriend. We keep in touch, but we've never really talked about that night since. My name is Simon. This happened last summer when I was 23. My girlfriend Cadence and I had been planning this camping trip for months. Just the two of us, no cell service, no distractions. We'd been together for about 1.5 years at that point, and honestly, things had been getting a little stale. Not bad, just routine. We figured a weekend in the woods would be good for us. We picked a spot in the Uwharrie National Forest in North Carolina. I'd been looking at different locations online for weeks, trying to find something that wasn't too crowded but also wasn't completely isolated. The place I settled on was this campground about 3 miles down a Forest Service road. According to the reviews, it had maybe 6 or 7 sites total, and they were pretty spread out from each other. We left Friday afternoon around 3, stopped for supplies at a grocery store near the forest entrance, and made it to the campground just before sunset. The road getting there was rough, lots of potholes and loose gravel, but my truck handled it fine. When we pulled into the main clearing, I was honestly pretty satisfied with my choice. There were a few picnic tables scattered around, a couple fire rings, and the sites themselves were tucked back into the trees enough that you'd have some privacy. We drove around slowly, checking out the different spots. Most of them were empty, which was good. We passed one site that had a blue sedan parked there, but I couldn't see anyone around it. Cadence pointed to a spot at the far end of the campground, right where the road dead-ended into the forest. It had a decent clearing for the tent and was positioned so that the trees blocked the view of the other campsites. We spent the next hour setting everything up. Cadence is one of those people who's really particular about how things are arranged, so I mostly just followed her instructions. By the time we were done, it was starting to get dark. I got a fire going while Cadence made sandwiches, and for a while, everything felt exactly how it was supposed to. We were sitting there drinking beer, watching the flames, not really talking about anything important, just existing together, which I think was kind of the point. Around 10 or so, Cadence went to brush her teeth at the spigot near the picnic tables. I stayed by the fire, poking at it with a stick and finishing my beer. That's when I noticed someone standing at the edge of our site, just beyond where the light of the fire reached. I jumped a little, I'm not gonna lie, because I genuinely hadn't heard anyone walk up. The guy apologized for startling me, and said he was camped over in the blue sedan and that he just wanted to introduce himself. His name was Aiden, and he looked to be about 30. He had this really intense way of maintaining eye contact that made me a little uncomfortable, but I obviously wasn't gonna say anything. Cadence walked back toward us, and I could tell from the way her hips were swaying that she was not pleased with the interruption. Aiden noticed her, turned, and said she'd picked a good spot, real secluded. He mentioned he was solo camping, trying to get away from people for the weekend. which seemed kind of contradictory since he was literally standing at our campsite making conversation. And by the way, as soon as Cadence walked back, I didn't exist anymore. This guy Aiden's full attention was on my girlfriend, which wasn't exactly surprising, but weird as hell. We talked for another minute or two, and by we, I mean he talked at Cadence while she just gave him awkward reply after awkward reply, waiting for him to get the hint. Eventually, I butted in and told him we wanted to get some sleep because we were waking up early, and that got him to leave. As soon as we walked into the darkness, I noticed he didn't use a flashlight or anything, which I thought was a little odd. Cadence and I agreed about the weirdness of the whole thing and decided to try and forget about it. We stayed up for another hour or so, then put out the fire and went to bed. I don't remember falling asleep, but I do remember waking up, and the moment I woke up, I realized something was wrong. It took me all of 3 seconds to realize I had woken up to voices somewhere in the distance. It sounded like 2 people having a conversation somewhere near our campsite. I looked over and saw Cadence fast asleep, and that's when the guardian instinct in me kicked in. I didn't freeze or cower in the tent, but rather actually went out to investigate. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and poked my head out. The voices stopped almost immediately, like they had heard me even though I thought I was being dead silent. As quickly as I could, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it around our campsite, but whoever had been there had either already left or was further away than I initially thought. Eventually, I went back inside the tent and tried to go back to sleep. It was a public campsite after all. People stay up really late on camping trips, so I didn't think it was anything threatening. I just hoped whoever had been out there got the hint to have their 3 a.m. talk somewhere far away from where I was trying to sleep. I didn't bother mentioning it to Cadence the next morning. I didn't really see the point in stressing her out over nothing. We spent most of the day hiking, which was a lot of fun and a decent workout, honestly. As the sun started to go down, I went to grab more firewood from a pile we'd made near the truck. That's when I noticed something on the windshield. It was a napkin, folded in half and tucked under the wiper blade. I pulled it out and unfolded it, and I was shocked to discover that it was a note. A note saying, "You should move your tent." I obviously wasn't going to keep that to myself, so I showed Cadence the note and told her what happened the night before. When she saw the note, she immediately asked if it was Aiden. I said, I guess so, because who else would it be? And as the 2 of us were discussing what to do next, obviously more than a little freaked out, as if on cue, who walks up but Aiden? He was wearing the exact same getup as the day before, and looking at him filled me with a mix of rage and fear. The rage won, and I told him he needed to stop just walking up like that, more aggressively than I probably should have. I was 100% convinced he was behind the note and the talking for the night before, and I wasn't going to let him think that he was fooling me. He said sorry in a gruff voice and said he was just checking up on us. Before I could respond, Cadence asked him why he'd need to check up on us, and actually said something that really surprised me. He told us he didn't want to freak us out, but that he was surprised to see people as young as we were at the campsite. He said that there was a bunch of weird stuff that had been known to occur around here, freaky stuff. He said he'd found deserted campsites deep in the woods, signs of people, belongings, and other weird things. I didn't really trust a word he was saying, but he said it so matter-of-factly that part of me thought he was being genuine. He went on to say that he heard people walking around his car the night before, so he was going to cut his trip short and go home before the sun set. Then he advised us to do the same. At that point, I wasn't going to argue, and it's not like Cadence wanted to stick around either, so we all started packing our stuff. It was pretty stressful, being as the sun was already almost set to begin with. I could tell Cadence was starting to freak out because her hands were shaking as she was putting stuff in the car, and I tried my best to calm her down, but I wasn't feeling great about things either. We finally finished getting everything in the car, and I started pulling out without another word. The sun was basically set at that point, and it would probably be fully dark in a few minutes. But as I was driving out, I noticed Aiden's blue sedan was still in his campsite, which I found strange. I saw Aiden crouched down near one of his tires, so I actually stopped my car. I asked him what he was doing, and he stepped back from his car to reveal a massive gash in the tire, something that was definitely done deliberately. There was no question about it. Cadence said holy f***, and I was pretty shocked to see it as well. I didn't know what to do. At first, He asked if I could give him a lift, but Cadence whispered that she wouldn't be comfortable with that, so I told him I couldn't, which led him to ask me if I would call the police for him as soon as I got service, and I told him I would. I pulled out of the campground and started down the dirt road. My headlights were on full blast. We were maybe 100 yards down the road when I glanced to my right and saw them. There were 3 figures standing in the woods, maybe 30 feet off the road. They weren't moving, and it didn't look like they were trying to hide either, almost like they wanted to be seen. I only saw them for a split second, but I was 100% sure they were people, and Cadence noticed them as well. My foot instinctively hit the brake. I don't even know why. Maybe some part of me thought I should go back and warn Aiden, or maybe I was just trying to process what I was seeing. But before I could think it through, Cadence grabbed my arm and screamed at me to drive, like a genuine scream. So I did. Cadence didn't say anything the entire way back to the main highway. As soon as I got service, I pulled over and called 911. I told them everything, and the dispatcher said they'd send someone to check on him. We never heard back from them. I wasn't really expecting to, but I had this sick feeling that something really wrong happened to Aiden, and that I was partly to blame. Cadence tried to reassure me that he was in on the whole thing, which is a possibility, but I think that's just a way to cope more than anything. Either way, this is still something I think about from time to time. So this was 2 Mays ago. I was 28 at the time, working remotely as an IT consultant out of Bozeman. The job wasn't anything special, but it paid okay, and being able to work from anywhere in the world was a huge plus for me. Unfortunately, I was going through kind of a rough patch at the time. I'd just gotten divorced about 3 months earlier, and I wasn't handling it well. Nothing I tried was working, and believe me, I tried everything. It seems a little foolish and naive looking back, but at one point I was convinced I'd spend the rest of my life in misery unless I did something drastic, like go off the grid and spend a few weeks in the wilderness type drastic. So that's kind of what I did. Camping has always been a big part of my life, so trekking out in the wilderness all alone isn't actually as crazy as it sounds, at least for me. I'm actually a lifelong scout. Couldn't make Eagle quite in time, but the point is, I know my way around wilderness better than most. I've got my old man to thank for that. I didn't want to go anywhere where there'd be other people around though. That would have defeated the whole point. I needed to be alone, so I did what any reasonable person does at 2 a.m. when they can't sleep. I went down the internet rabbit hole. Eventually, I found this old Montana backcountry camping forum that had a bunch of posts about some unofficial sites in the Helena, Lewis, and Clark National Forest. So right then and there, I made the decision. The next morning, I planned everything out. The only person I told where I was going was my brother, and I didn't even mention the specific spot to him, just a vague description of the general area. I had a bunch of PTO saved up, so missing a week or so of work wasn't the end of the world. If I'm remembering correctly, that was a Tuesday, so it must have been a Thursday by the time I had my truck fully loaded up. I had enough supplies to last me the full week and then some. Freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and all the other essentials. And of course, my Remington 700. I'm not a gun nut or anything, but you don't go that deep into the Montana wilderness without protection from wildlife. The drive out there was about 4 hours from Bozeman. First 3.5 were easy. Highway to county road to forest service road. That last bit though, what a headache. My GPS kept trying to reroute me because the service road I needed wasn't in its system. After some painful backtracking and double-checking the descriptions of some of those online posts, I found this overgrown trail that seemed to match up with what someone had written. Twice I had to stop to move branches and other debris that were blocking the path. My truck's a decent 4x4, but I was starting to worry about getting stuck. I drove along the path until it was impossible to go any further, at which point I just shut my engine. I knew I'd have to reverse out of there when the time came to leave, but I had been prepared for that, so I wasn't too concerned. As soon as I stepped out of my truck, I was pretty confident I was in the right spot. But that far into the wilderness, there's not really a right spot since everything's as remote as everything else. Either way, I was pleased. There was a clearing not too far from the cluster of trees I had parked in front of, and it looked like a perfect place to set up camp. Except there was already a tent there. I noticed it almost immediately. It was this old olive green tent that looked like it was from the 80s. My first thought was that someone else had found those coordinates, but the tent looked like it had been there for years. There was actual mold growing on the seams, like visible from 20 feet away kind of mold. I walked over out of curiosity. I probably shouldn't have, but whatever. I called out a friendly hello and waited. There was no response. The zipper was partly open, so I just unzipped it the rest of the way. And let me tell you, the smell in there was god-awful. It smelled like something had died inside. The stench was unbearable, but I was in too deep and was too curious to just walk away. I looked around the tent and saw an empty sleeping bag, some soup cans, and a little notebook. I withstood the nastiness just long enough to grab the notebook and reach my head back into the pure air. There wasn't anything else in the tent besides what I already mentioned, so I didn't see the need to keep investigating. But something was making that smell, which I didn't really understand. But anyway, after stepping out of the tent, I started flipping through this little notebook and immediately realized what it is. Pages and pages of tally marks. There must have been hundreds of them in there, all in groups of 7. The last page had 42 groups, which is over 8 months. I wasn't really spooked at that point, more so curious and kind of excited to have stumbled upon my own little mystery. But after flipping through the notebook a few times, there wasn't really much else to do. I ended up keeping it. What was I going to do, return it? But anyway, I decided to set up my own camp on the opposite side of the clearing, a decent distance away from the tent, but close enough to keep an eye on it. I didn't like the thought of letting it out of my line of sight. As I settled into the spot and acclimated myself with my surroundings, I realized there were no signs that anyone had actually camped here before. I went for a pretty extensive hike and didn't find any old fire rings, trash, trails, footprints, anything that would even marginally suggest another human. It was a really clear night that night. I remember that distinctly because the stars were incredible out there. The drive and setup had exhausted me, so I fell asleep pretty quickly. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. I had no idea what time it was, but I knew for a fact I didn't wake up to nothing. I'm a very heavy sleeper, even out in the wilderness, so I knew something was wrong. I froze in the dark and listened, trying to hear for an animal or whatever else could have woken me up, and after about 30 seconds, I heard it. Whispers. It sounded like 2 or 3 different voices, and if I had to guess, I'd say they were maybe 20 feet from my tent. They were having some kind of conversation, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I was so freaked out I started sweating. When you go that deep in the wilderness to be alone, the last thing you're expecting to stumble upon is another person, let alone multiple people. It doesn't sound like the scariest thing per se, but in the moment I was terrified. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, pretending to be asleep. The voices stopped, but I still didn't want to move. And after a few seconds, I started hearing footsteps around my tent. I realized whoever was out there was circling my tent, the way an animal might. Instinctively, my hand went straight to my rifle, which turned out to be the correct decision because not 2 seconds later, someone started yanking on my tent zipper. When it didn't budge, thanks to the clips I'd put on, they pulled back. I had my rifle aimed directly at the tent flap, and a very strong part of me wanted to just fire right then. I was expecting the person messing with my tent to just leave, but no. They started scratching the flap like they were trying to cut their way in, and that's what sent me over the edge. I spoke up, saying I had a gun and to back the fuck off. The scratching stopped immediately. There were a few seconds of complete silence, and then I heard footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps running away in what sounded like different directions. It sounded like at least 3 people, which was somehow 10 times worse than the thought of it being just 2. They didn't all run the same way, which struck me as strange. I didn't sleep much that night, but I felt very safe with my rifle by my side. As soon as the sun rose, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, making a big show of brandishing my rifle. I immediately looked over at where the old moldy tent had been. It was gone. I walked over to the spot where I knew it had been. There was no ground depression, no stake holes, nothing. The grass wasn't even flattened, but I knew for a fact there had been a tent there. I had stared at it for hours the previous day, What I did find were footprints. Bare human footprints all around my campsite in a rough circle about 20 feet out. There were tons of them, and they were different sizes, which confirmed to me that there had been more than just 2 people out there. Some of them were also really deep, like whoever made them had been standing there for a long time. One set of prints led over to a big pine tree at the edge of the clearing. I walked over, and that's when I saw them. Fresh cuts in the bark. I knew what they were. Tally marks. 7 groups of 7, and the start of an 8th group. Just like the notebook. I just kind of stood there, trying to make sense of it. The notebook had been counting something for over 8 months, and now there were fresh marks on this tree, right next to my campsite. I didn't want to think about what that meant. It gets much, much worse though, because as I was backing away from the tree, I noticed something else. It was and still is the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. There was a dead squirrel hanging from a low branch a few feet away, tied up with what looked like a fishing line. I'm not squeamish about dead animals, I'm a hunter for Christ's sake, but something about the way it was positioned made me want to puke. I didn't really need any more of an indication. I immediately ran back to my campsite and started packing my stuff as fast as I could. I'll admit that my hands were actually shaking while I took down my sight, and I was having trouble focusing on the task at hand without looking over my shoulder every few seconds. After what felt like forever, I finally finished packing everything and started jogging towards my truck. I threw everything in, jumped in the truck, and started backing out. Part of me thought my tires were going to be slashed or something else, but thankfully my truck was untouched. The path was narrow, and backing out was even harder than pulling in, so the ordeal was torture. It was hell, but I made it, and I don't think I was followed. By the time I made it back home, I decided I wouldn't even bother calling anyone. I did not think there was a point. Like, realistically, what would I even report? It's not like anyone would go that far into the woods to investigate. The thing that freaks me out the most is the sight of that squirrel. No one does that unless they're trying to send a message or a threat. I honestly don't know what would have happened if I stayed another night, or if I hadn't been armed.